"Yes, sir," Bob said, pulling his wallet out of his bag. "I left it on Fayetteville Street by the bank. I thought you might want it back." He held out the wallet, moving slowly and precisely. Heller snatched it out of Bob's hand, opened it, and began to check the contents. His jaw tensed as he counted the cash, then looked at Bob with even more suspicion. "Is that all there was in there?" he demanded. Heller was momentarily confused, but quickly recovered. "Don't play with me. I'm calling the police. We'll see what they have to say about your story. You'll find out what really happened in a minute, so stay tuned and subscribe, and we'll get to the story." Bob Coleman, a 35-year-old black man with a neatly trimmed beard and a quiet confidence, stepped out of First Citizens Bank, a worn leather satchel slung over his shoulder. He had just deposited his paycheck from the local community college, where he worked as a part-time history instructor, a job that barely covered rent but kept him connected to his love of the past. Adjusting his glasses and heading toward the bus stop, he suddenly noticed something on the sidewalk, a brown leather wallet, slightly scuffed and partially open. Bob paused, glancing around. The street was busy, but no one seemed to have noticed the lost item. He crouched down, carefully picking up the wallet as if its owner might be watching from afar. Inside, he found a driver's license, a few credit cards, and a wad of cash, about $200. The license belonged to Richard Heller, a 62-year-old man with a stern face and thinning gray hair. The address was local, just a few blocks away. Bob's first instinct was to return it. He had once lost a wallet himself and still remembered that sinking feeling of helplessness. He placed the wallet in his bag and scanned the street once more, half expecting someone to come running, waving their arms. No one. He glanced at his watch. 4:45 p.m. The bus would arrive soon, but he couldn't just leave the wallet. He decided to walk to the address listed on the ID, a high-rise condominium building he had passed many times but never entered. The building's lobby was all glass and polished marble, the kind of place that practically shouted wealth. The doorman, dressed in a crisply ironed uniform, eyed Bob carefully as he approached, his gaze lingering a moment longer than necessary. Bob straightened his shoulders and offered a restrained smile. "Good evening," he said, keeping his voice steady. "I found a wallet on the street. Belongs to Richard Heller. I believe he lives here. Would you mind letting him know?" The doorman, a middle-aged man with a name tag that read Carl, hesitated but nodded. "Wait here," he muttered, disappearing into the back office. Bob stood near the entrance, feeling the weight of curious glances from residents passing by. He was used to it, the silent stares, the unspoken assumptions. Growing up in North Carolina, he had learned to meet them with outward calm, even as his chest tightened. A few minutes later, a man emerged from the elevator. Richard Heller looked exactly like his ID photo, tall, broad-shouldered, his face etched with irritation. His tailored suit was slightly rumpled, as if after a long day. He walked up to Bob, narrowing his eyes. "You the one who found my wallet?" Heller's voice was sharp, accusatory. "Yes, sir," Bob replied, pulling the wallet from his bag. "Found it on Fayetteville Street, near the bank. Thought you'd want it back." He extended the wallet, his movements slow and deliberate. Heller snatched it from Bob's hand, flipped it open, and began inspecting the contents. His jaw tightened as he counted the cash, then shot Bob a look of deeper suspicion. "Is this all that was in it?" he demanded. Bob blinked, puzzled. "That's how I found it. I didn't touch anything." Heller's lips curled into a mocking smirk. "Right. You just found it. And I'm supposed to believe you didn't take anything." The words hit like a slap. Bob's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice calm. "I understand you're upset, Mr. Heller, but I only wanted to do the right thing. I brought it here straight away." The doorman, Carl, shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between the two men. A small crowd of residents had gathered in the lobby, their murmurs barely audible, but heavy with judgment. Bob felt the air grow thick, that all too familiar sensation of being measured, reduced to a stereotype. Heller stepped closer, his voice dropping to a growl. "You think I'm stupid? I know how this works. People like you." "People like me?" Bob interrupted, his voice still calm but firm, his gaze locked on Heller. "You mean the kind who return lost property? Or were you trying to say something else?" Heller faltered for a moment, but quickly recovered. "Don't play games with me. I'm calling the police. Let's see what they have to say about your story." Bob's stomach tightened, but he didn't flinch. He'd been in situations like this before, accused, dismissed, presumed guilty by default. He knew how easily things could spiral, especially with someone like Heller, whose privilege radiated like heat. But he also knew he'd done nothing wrong. "Go ahead," he said quietly. "I'll wait." The police arrived within minutes, 2 officers in pressed uniforms who seemed to know Heller by name. They listened as he recounted his version of events, his voice rising with indignation. Bob stood silently, hands folded in front of him, until the officers turned to him. The younger one, crew-cut and stern, asked for his ID. Bob handed it over and explained how he had found the wallet and brought it to Heller's building. The older officer, gray-haired and unreadable, jotted down notes, his expression neutral. "Look," Bob said, his voice steady despite the knot in his chest. "I teach at Wake Tech. I have no reason to steal. I just wanted to help." Heller scoffed. "Help? Seriously? I want him arrested. Theft, right now." The younger officer hesitated, glancing at his partner. "Mr. Heller, we have no evidence of a crime. He returned the wallet. There's no proof anything is missing." "That's not good enough," Heller barked. "I'll sue if I have to." Bob's heart sank. Sue. The word carried a weight he knew all too well. The stories of friends and family tangled in a system that rarely saw them as innocent. But another feeling flickered to life beneath the dread: resolve. In his 20s, he had studied law, working as a clerk in a small firm before life steered him toward teaching. He wasn't a lawyer, but he knew enough to stand his ground. And more importantly, he couldn't let Heller's prejudice write his fate. "Fine," Bob said, meeting Heller's stare. "If it's a fight you want, I'll see you in court. But you're making a mistake." The courtroom was small but suffocating, with polished wooden benches and air heavy with the scent of old paper and cleaning solution. Bob sat at the defendant's table, wearing a second-hand suit he had carefully pressed the night before. Across the room, Heller sat with his attorney, a sleek man in a pinstripe suit who exuded confidence. Presiding over the case was Judge Harold Grayson, a stern-looking white man in his 60s, his white hair framing a weathered face. Bob had done his research. Grayson was known for being tough, and legal circles whispered that he didn't always check his personal biases at the door. On paper, the case was simple. Heller accused Bob of stealing cash from the wallet before returning it. There was no evidence, no witnesses, no receipts, nothing but Heller's word. But Bob knew the real battle wasn't over evidence. It was over perception. The story Heller was selling, and the assumptions Judge Grayson might be tempted to buy. Heller's attorney called him to the stand first. Heller retold the story with theatrical flair, painting Bob as a cunning opportunist who returned the wallet to cover his tracks. "I know how much money I had," Heller insisted, his voice quivering with righteous anger. "At least $500, maybe more. He took the rest and thought I wouldn't notice." Bob listened, his face composed even as his mind raced. He had prepared for this, poring over legal texts and case precedents night after night, sharpening his arguments. When it was his turn, he chose to represent himself, earning curious glances from the courtroom. He stood, adjusted his tie, and addressed the judge directly. "Your Honor," Bob began, his voice clear and measured, "I'm not a lawyer, but the truth doesn't require a degree to stand. I found Mr. Heller's wallet on the street. I didn't have to pick it up. I could have just walked by. But I brought it to his home because it was the right thing to do. Mr. Heller's accusation has no evidence, no receipts, no bank statements, nothing to show how much money was in that wallet. He's asking you to take his word, and I wonder why his word should weigh more than mine." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Grayson's eyes narrowed, but he leaned forward listening. Bob continued, his tone calm but unyielding. "I teach history at Wake Tech. I've lived in Raleigh my whole life. I've never been arrested, never charged with a crime. But the moment I returned that wallet, Mr. Heller decided I was a thief. Why? What gave him that certainty? I think we all know the answer." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. The room felt charged, the weight of his words settling over the spectators. Heller shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face flushing. Bob turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, this case isn't about a wallet. It's about assumptions. And if we're going to talk about justice, let's talk about what's really on trial here." Judge Grayson's expression remained unreadable, but he didn't interrupt. Bob called the doorman, Carl, as a witness. Nervous but honest, Carl confirmed that Bob had brought the wallet straight to the building and hadn't tampered with its contents. Bob then submitted his bank records, showing no unusual deposits, and a time-stamped deposit slip from the bank proving where he had been before finding the wallet. Every step he took was deliberate, every argument grounded in logic and fact. The courtroom in Raleigh buzzed with hushed conversations as Judge Harold Grayson tapped his gavel, demanding silence. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The scent of old wood and cleaning supplies mingled with the tension that hung over the room. Bob Coleman sat at the defendant's table, his hands resting calmly on a stack of notes he had prepared during sleepless nights. Across from him sat Richard Heller, his face flushed with barely restrained anger as he whispered to his attorney, Mr. Stephen Crow, whose polished, expensive shoes gleamed under the table. Bob had already taken the first step, presenting his case with a clarity that surprised even the most skeptical observers. His testimony, supported by a bank statement and the doorman Carl's account, had laid down a solid foundation. But he knew it wouldn't be enough. Judge Grayson, known for his reputation as a tough and perhaps biased judge, was the key obstacle. And Heller, alongside his lawyer, had no intention of backing down. The case teetered on the edge, and Bob knew that every move from here on had to be flawless. Grayson adjusted his glasses and looked at Bob. "Mr. Coleman, you are representing yourself. Are you ready to proceed?" His voice was dry, but there was a hint of curiosity beneath it. "Yes, Your Honor," Bob replied, rising to his feet. He felt the weight of every gaze in the room, the jurors, the spectators, even Heller's, fixed on him. But his pulse stayed steady. His whole life had taught him that calm in the storm was true strength, and now he intended to prove it. "I would like to call Mr. Heller for cross-examination," Bob said, his voice firm but without a trace of arrogance. Crow, Heller's lawyer, shot up from his seat. "Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Coleman is not a licensed attorney. This could be an attempt to manipulate or intimidate my client." Grayson raised an eyebrow, his gaze shifting to Bob. "Mr. Coleman, are you aware of the boundaries of acceptable conduct during cross-examination?" "Yes, Your Honor," Bob replied. "I only intend to clarify the facts as stated by Mr. Heller. No manipulation, just the truth." Grayson hesitated, then gave a slight nod. "Objection overruled. Proceed, Mr. Coleman, but stay on point." Reluctantly, Heller took the witness stand, his posture radiating irritation. Bob approached, holding a sheet of notes in his hands. He didn't rush, allowing the silence in the room to grow, knowing that every moment of tension was working in his favor. "Mr. Heller," Bob began, his tone polite but steady, "you stated that your wallet contained at least $500. Can you provide any proof of that? For example, a bank withdrawal slip or a check?" Heller scowled. "I don't carry slips around. I know how much was there. I withdrew the money that morning." "Understood," Bob nodded as if agreeing. "And which bank did you withdraw the money from? And at what time?" Heller hesitated, his eyes darting. "Wells Fargo, I think. Around 10 o'clock. Bob made a note without breaking eye contact. "Thank you. Your Honor, I request that the court obtain Mr. Heller's bank statement for that day to verify his claim. This is standard procedure in cases like this." Crow was on his feet again. "Objection. This is an invasion of my client's privacy." But Bob was ready. "Your Honor," Mr. Heller himself made the amount in his wallet the central point of his accusation. If he claims to have withdrawn $500, the statement will either confirm or refute it. This isn't an invasion. It's the pursuit of the truth. Grayson leaned forward, his fingers tapping on the desk. "I will allow the request for the statement, but only for that specific day. Mr. Crow, please ensure it is provided by tomorrow." Heller paled, his confidence visibly shaken. Bob returned to his questioning. "Mr. Heller, you said I took the money because, as you put it, I looked suspicious. Can you explain what exactly about my behavior seemed suspicious to you?" Heller pressed his lips together. You were holding my wallet, and you didn't look like someone who'd return it. That's all. So you decided I was a thief before I even said a word?" Bob paused, letting the question settle. "Or perhaps it was because of how I look. My clothes, my skin color." The room froze. The jurors, mostly older individuals, exchanged glances. Some shifted uncomfortably, but Bob could see his words had struck home. Heller flushed, his hands curling into fists. "I didn't. That's not what I meant," he muttered. "But it's what you said," Bob replied softly, yet relentlessly. "And I believe that's what brought us here. Not the wallet, but your assumptions about me." Bob returned to his table, casting one last look at Grayson. "No further questions, Your Honor." The next day, the tension in the courtroom only deepened. Heller's bank statement arrived, and it showed no withdrawal of $500 on the day in question. Holding the document, Bob addressed the jury with his closing statement. He stood tall, his voice calm yet piercing. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "this case was never about a wallet. It's about how quickly we judge each other based on appearances, on biases we don't even realize we hold. I didn't take a single cent from Mr. Heller's wallet. I returned it because it was the right thing to do. But instead of gratitude, I was met with accusation. And I ask you, if I were white, dressed in an expensive suit, would I be sitting here today?" He turned to Grayson. "Your Honor, I'm not asking for leniency. I'm asking for justice, not just for myself, but for everyone judged before they've had a chance to speak." As Bob sat down, the courtroom fell silent. Even Crow, preparing his closing remarks, seemed less certain than before. Grayson, whose face had remained stone-like throughout the trial, now looked at Bob with something resembling respect. The jury returned a verdict after 3 hours. Bob was found not guilty. But for him, it wasn't just about the win. As he stepped out of the courtroom, an elderly juror, a woman with gray hair and kind eyes, stopped him. "Mr. Coleman," she said softly, "you made me think." "Thank you." Bob nodded, feeling the tightness in his chest finally ease. "That's all I ever wanted," he replied. He stepped out onto the street, where the evening sun bathed Raleigh in golden light. Heller, standing by his car, looked at him, not with anger, but with confusion. Bob said nothing, just kept walking toward the bus stop. He knew he had changed something today, even if just a little, and that was enough to keep moving forward. The evening air in Raleigh was cool, with a faint scent of autumn leaves, as Bob Coleman stepped out of the courthouse. The streetlights had just flickered to life, casting a soft glow over the cobblestones of Fayetteville Street. He took a deep breath, feeling the tension of the past few weeks slowly begin to fade. The word, "not guilty," still echoed in his ears, but the verdict brought no euphoria. Instead, a quiet, steady feeling had settled in his chest. He hadn't just defended himself, he had made people think. The words of an older juror, her heartfelt "thank you," warmed him like a scarf on a cold day. Bob adjusted the strap of his bag and headed toward the bus stop. Cars hummed past. A group of students laughed somewhere nearby, and the rich scent of coffee from the closest cafe tempted him to pause. But he kept walking, his thoughts buzzing. The trial was over, but the story wasn't. He knew that the wallet incident, small in the grand scheme of things, had left a mark. The only question was what to do with it now. The next morning, Bob sat at his desk in his cramped apartment on the edge of town. Sunlight filtered through old blinds, highlighting the stack of history and law books he hadn't put away since the court days. His laptop hummed, open to the website of the local newspaper. The headline proclaimed boldly, "College lecturer wins court case over theft allegation. Sparks debate on bias." The article was brief, but mentioned his name, recounting how he, representing himself, had dismantled Richard Heller's accusation. In the comment section below, a fierce debate was already unfolding. Some called him a hero, others accused him of playing the race card. Bob sighed and closed the laptop. He wasn't looking for fame, but he understood that his story had struck a nerve. In Raleigh, like in many American cities, conversations about race and justice were always tense, especially for the older generation, who had witnessed both the civil rights protests of the 60s and today's social debates. He felt a responsibility, not just for himself, but for those who had faced similar accusations without his knowledge or confidence. His phone buzzed. A message from his colleague at Wake Tech, sociology professor Ellen Wilson, an older woman with a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue. "Bob, you're in the news. Come by campus, we need to talk. I've got an idea." Bob smiled. Ellen always had ideas, and most of them were either brilliant or completely mad. He quickly got dressed, pulling on his usual shirt and jeans, and headed to the college. The Wake Tech campus buzzed with students rushing to class. The scent of freshly cut grass mixed with the cheap coffee aroma drifting from the cafeteria. Bob found Ellen in her office, surrounded by towers of books and scattered papers. She sat at her desk, holding the very same newspaper he had read online. "You knew they wrote about you," she said instead of a greeting, her gray eyes sparkling with excitement. "I saw it," Bob nodded, sitting down across from her. "But I'm not sure I want to be at the center of all this." "Too late, Coleman." Ellen leaned back in her chair. "You're already there. And this is an opportunity. Your story isn't just about a wallet or a courtroom. It's about how the system works against people who look like you. And you beat it. Not everyone can say that. Bob shrugged, though deep down he knew she was right. So, what's the idea? Ellen leaned in, lowering her voice as if she were sharing a state secret. We've been talking, a few of us here at the faculty, about hosting a series of workshops on campus. About racial bias justice, about how people can protect themselves in situations like yours. And we want you to be part of it. You're not just a history lecturer, Bob. You're living proof that knowledge and calm can change the game. Bob hesitated. He wasn't fond of being in the spotlight, but the idea resonated with his beliefs. I'm not a lawyer, Ellen. I just figured out how not to drown. Exactly why we need you, she shot back. You're not some suit from a law firm. You're one of us. Students will listen to you. And not just students, I want to bring in the community. Seniors, small business owners, even someone like your Mr. Heller. At the mention of Heller, Bob frowned. He hadn't seen him since the courtroom, but that look, part anger, part confusion, had stuck with him. Heller won't come to a workshop, he said. He probably still thinks I tricked him. Maybe, Ellen admitted, but you made him doubt. And that's a start. Think about it, Bob. You could be more than part of the conversation. You could be the spark. Over the next few weeks, Bob threw himself into preparing for the workshops. Together with Ellen and other faculty members, he worked on a program that combined legal advice, historical context, and practical strategies for confronting bias. They titled the series Justice in Action and sent invitations all over Raleigh to church groups, local libraries, and community centers. Bob also wrote a short op-ed for the paper, telling his story in his own words and ending with a call. Change begins when we speak the truth. Let's speak together. The response was bigger than he had expected. More than 100 people showed up at the first workshop in the college auditorium, students, elderly couples, and local activists alike. Standing before them, Bob felt his heart pounding, but his voice remained steady. He spoke about the wallet, the trial, about how knowledge and calm had helped him hold his ground. Then he handed the floor to Ellen, who dove into the statistics on racial bias in the justice system, followed by a volunteer attorney who explained how to protect one's rights. During the break, an older woman approached Bob, the same juror from the trial. Her name was Marjorie, and she held a notebook filled with scribbled notes. "I told my church about you," she said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "We'd like you to come speak to us. People need to hear this." Bob smiled, feeling warmth spread through his chest. "I'll think about it, Marjorie. Thank you for coming." When he returned to the hall, his eyes caught a familiar face in the back row. Richard Heller. He sat with his arms crossed, his expression tense. But he was there. Bob felt his throat tighten. He didn't know what had brought Heller, curiosity, guilt, or something else. But his presence was a sign. Maybe not all was lost. The workshop ended with applause, but Bob wasn't in a hurry to leave. He watched as Heller stood up, hesitated, and then headed for the exit. Bob caught up with him at the door. "Mr. Heller," he said softly but firmly. "I'm glad you came." Heller paused, his eyes avoiding Bob's. "I read your article," he muttered. "Thought I should listen." Bob nodded, not pushing. "I hope you heard something useful." Heller hesitated, his fingers tightening around his briefcase strap. "I'm not saying I was wrong," he said finally. "But maybe I rushed to judgment." It wasn't an apology, but for Bob, it was enough. He extended his hand. "Let's just move forward." Heller looked at the hand, then slowly shook it. His palm was cold, but the grip was firm. He nodded once and walked away, leaving Bob with the sense that something had shifted, not a mountain, but a stone. That night, Bob sat on the balcony of his apartment, holding a mug of tea. The city buzzed below, its lights twinkling like stars. He thought about Marjorie, about Heller, about the students who, after the workshop, had asked how they could help change the world. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing. Every conversation, every small step toward understanding was a beginning, and he was ready to follow that path, wherever it might lead. The morning sun barely pierced through the thick clouds over Raleigh, casting a soft, diffused light over the Wake Tech campus. In the large lecture hall, conversations buzzed, blending with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the creak of chairs. Today was the final session of the Justice in Action seminar series, and the room was packed, students, elderly city residents, even a few local journalists with notepads in hand. Bob Coleman stood by the podium, his fingers lightly touching the pages of his notes, though he had long since memorized his speech. Behind him, a quote from Martin Luther King hung on the screen. "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Ellen Wilson, sitting in the front row, nodded approvingly as Bob began to speak. "We're not gathered here to accuse," he said, his voice filling the room. "We're here to understand. My story is just one of many. But if it made any of you think, ask questions, or take a step toward change, then that's already a victory." He spoke about the wallet, the trial, about being accused based on assumptions rather than evidence. But this time, he went further, sharing the stories of others: a student unjustly detained by the police, an elderly woman ignored in a store because of her appearance, a veteran who faced prejudice in a hospital. Each story was a thread in a larger fabric, and Bob skillfully wove them together, showing that the fight for justice wasn't about heroic deeds, but about quiet, everyday steps. When he finished, the room burst into applause. People stood, their faces glowing, from an elderly couple holding hands to a young journalist scribbling furiously. Bob felt warmth swell in his chest, but his gaze lingered on a figure in the back rows. Richard Heller. He had come again, this time with a notepad in hand, and though his face remained stern, there was something new in his eyes, not anger, but reflection. After the seminar, Bob stayed behind to answer questions. A long line formed, students seeking advice, elderly women sharing their own stories. Marjorie, one of the jurors from the trial, hugged him, her eyes glistening with tears. "You've done more than you think," she said. "My church is holding its own justice meetings now. Because of you." Bob simply smiled, feeling the weight of her words settle deep inside. When the crowd finally thinned, he noticed Heller waiting by the door. Bob approached, his hands tucked into his pockets, his posture open but cautious. "Mr. Heller," he said, "didn't expect to see you here again." Heller hesitated, his fingers nervously gripping the strap of his briefcase. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, his voice quiet, almost unsure. "About that day, about the trial. I wasn't ready to admit it, but I was wrong. Not about the money," he added quickly, "but about you. I made assumptions I had no right to make." Bob stayed silent, letting Heller speak. It wasn't a full apology, but it was sincere, a rare thing from a man who was used to staying on the defensive. "I haven't changed overnight," Heller continued, looking away. "But these seminars, they made me listen, and I want to help. I've got connections in the business community. Maybe I could fund your future events. Anonymously, if you prefer." Bob raised an eyebrow, surprised. He didn't fully trust Heller, but he saw an opportunity in his words. "I'll talk to the team," he said. "But thank you. That means something." Heller nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Don't thank me. Just keep doing what you're doing." He turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the crowd. That night, Bob sat in his apartment, holding an old photograph, himself as a boy at a picnic with his parents. His father, a bus driver, used to say, "Justice isn't a gift, it's something you fight for." Bob smiled, feeling that he had fulfilled part of that promise. His phone lit up with a message from Ellen. City Hall wants to partner. They're offering a grant for a statewide program. Are you ready for the big league? Bob leaned back in his chair, gazing at the lights of Raleigh through the window. He didn't know where this path would lead, to larger seminars, political change, or simply new conversations. But he knew he was ready to walk it. Every dialogue, every listener, every small step brought the world a little closer to something better. And that was enough. He picked up his pen and began outlining the next seminar, his handwriting clear and steady. Outside the window, the city breathed, and in its rhythm, Bob heard the echo of hope, not loud, but unyielding.